This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 88 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we are joined by the host of E60 and the Sports Reporters on ESPN. I believe he is a 14-time Emmy winner. You could correct me if that number is off. He is a sports journalist in the truest sense. He is Jeremy Schaap. Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Have you started thinking about working on an E60 that will tell the story of how an ESPN personality went from hosting First Take to becoming the president of the United States?
I think we should start planning, right? I mean, you know, when Hakeem Jeffries starts touting your possible candidacy, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's real.
I'm just hoping I get a Plum ambassadorship somewhere. You know, if it happens, I'm thinking about in the Court of St. James's is always nice, but maybe somewhere with better weather. It kind of reminds me of it was in '69 that Norman Mailer was running for mayor in New York, and Jimmy Breslin, obviously the great columnist, but also my dad's best friend, was running for city council president. I don't even think there was a city council presidency technically, but he ran anyway. It was kind of a joint ticket, Mailer and Breslin. And you know, my father was asked if he would be part of the administration. I think he politely declined. He had more important business to work on with Joe Namath that year. But it is interesting, right?
Yeah, very interesting. Is there a sports media personality that you think would make a good president?
Ooh, that's interesting. You know, I'd have to think about that at some length. Obviously, Howard Cosell.
Yeah,
if you remember, I think, you know, he never ran, right? But I mean, you could certainly say Stephen A. is this generation's Howard Cosell. And I remember, I think Cosell at least talked about running for the Senate from New York or the governorship. I kind of get it mixed up a little bit with the scene in The Godfather, right? Where, you know, I think Vito's talking to Michael and they're talking about it was too soon, you know, generations, Governor Corleone, Senator Corleone. And Howard, I think, entertained some of those thoughts. It is interesting, though, right? Because, you know, we don't think twice about athletes running for office, right? And obviously, there have been a lot of athletes around the world, not just in the U.S., who have been very prominent politically. Yeah. So I guess at one level, you could say if an athlete can do it, why can't the people who cover them?
Yeah.
Right? It's the same world.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I mean, I grew up in New York. Bill Bradley was in the Senate at the time, and Jim. I mean, we could go on and on.
Yeah, no, it is. It's definitely just the way it's kind of taken on a bit of a life of its own in the last couple months is certainly interesting to see. Going from because for years he has kind of teased the idea of being president, but it always just seemed so playful. Whereas now it's actually gaining a little bit of traction. I still don't actually envision it happening, but it's undoubtedly
a big pay cut.
Yes, it is. And he doesn't shy away from noting that is one of his biggest concerns about it is the pay cut.
And we have to ask ourselves really over the course of the last several decades how much a consideration. Look, you know. Obviously, a lot of people want to be president, leader of the free world, etc. But generally speaking, when we talk about people going into politics, into public service, it has changed, and it is a smaller pool. And I remember reading, I think, an essay about this by Calvin Trillin, where he was talking about his theory was that the explosion on Wall Street in the 80s in terms of how much money you could make in that world relative to going to work for the State Department or whatever it might be, it became so vast that a lot of people who otherwise might have chosen that kind of life, diplomacy or politics, some kind of public service, law school leading to running for local office and eventually something bigger, didn't do it because in his generation, and he was a Yale guy, right? It was like the difference was so much smaller between that kind of life in terms of your creature comforts and your salary. And then, everything changed in the 80s.
Yeah. Is there, what are current or former presidents that you've interviewed in your career?
Well, you know what? I think the only former president I have interviewed is George W. Bush, and he was not in office at the time. I have not interviewed a sitting president, which would be nice, but I interviewed George W. Bush on a number of occasions. And one of them, interestingly, was at the Invictus Games down in Orlando. I think that was 2016. And I did a panel with President Bush and Prince Harry, about wounded warriors, especially about the invisible wounds of war. That was fascinating. And then I did another such panel with President Bush at his library in, is it Dallas or Fort Worth? Now I can't remember, but I was there. I think it's Dallas. And it was great. I mean, he's always been a pleasure to be around, the stuff that we've done together. And he's very funny. One of the things, if you have a chance to go to the George W. Bush Presidential Library down there, there's all the stuff you would expect from any typical presidential library, but there's one little corner where they've got, a video running on a loop, and it's not his top 10. It's his most famous gaffes, like fool me once, and all that kind of stuff. Like, so you have to have a sense of humor about yourself to have that in your presidential library. And he's always been great to me. Yeah. I did have dinner once with Bill Clinton, just a few people. This was back in 2015. And it was a very interesting dinner because it was me and him and his brother-in-law, Tony Rodham, and it was Tony's kids and a friend of mine from Kansas City who was close to them. And it was like a 3-hour dinner. It was fascinating. And President Clinton just talked the whole time. I've met some people who can talk and dominate, as you might imagine in this business, but he is definitely at the top of the list. And of course, that's what you want to hear.
Yeah, right. Just kind of let it happen.
But yeah, that was fun.
So other than Stephen A. Smith potentially becoming president, what is a sports story that hasn't been investigated much yet, or maybe it has been investigated and there's just more to the story, but something that you think deserves more attention?
Oh, I think, if you're asking me right off the bat, like something big right now that I'm hoping we do a full treatment on, I think it's the role of Saudi Arabia right now in the world of sports. Yeah. Everything that's been going on, live and beyond, obviously. Certainly there's the topic of sports washing, which we talk about, but it goes beyond that as well. When so much of the power in the world of sports right now resides in Saudi Arabia, and the impact that has on the rest of the world, the leagues around the world, where there is so much money. That's, I think, a fascinating topic that I'm guessing your average American sports fan hasn't spent a great deal of time thinking about. Beyond the live controversy, which really kind of peaked. What was that now? 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But
2 years ago,
But I think that's a fascinating story. There's the business of sports. There's actually what's going on the field in sports. But that one I think is kind of a global story, and we're always looking, over at E60, especially for these kinds of big stories, which we can spend a lot of time working on, and we get a lot of time on the air to discuss.
How long do you usually spend on an E60? I mean, I assume it varies, but say what is the if there is an average, or even what is the longest amount of time that you spend?
Oh, well, I mean, these are kind of the outliers when you work on a story for years and years and years, and you sometimes know that going in because you're following a story as it's developing. That's been the case with some stories I've done about medical issues, about the struggle to create cures for obscure diseases that affect people in the world of sports. And you might follow that literally for years.
Yeah.
You might revisit stories that you did years ago and come back. Like we recently did a documentary, speaking of medical miracles, on Gunnar Esiason and Boomer Esiason, which I was very proud of. I thought it was an important story that, again, a lot of people in the world of sports might have missed about the developments, the progress that has been made in the fight against cystic fibrosis. And, we first did a story about Gunnar and Boomer 17 years ago and revisit. But a typical story, it depends on the different moving parts, depends where it is. If we're doing something like we did a story about the World Cup and Qatar, which I thought was one of our most important stories a decade ago, from beginning to end, you're working on that story for a year and a half, 2 years, finding the right people to talk to, getting all of the permissions that are required to shoot in the country, to talk to the people in power in the country. Those things can take a long time, or you could do it, on a much more expedited basis, different kinds of stories. Right now, the E60s that we have coming up that I've reported, Jim Abbott, that's coming up. By the time that runs in July, it will be almost exactly 2 years after we did the first interviews for it.
Oh, wow.
And part of that has to do with the film festival circuit. Like you want to, sometimes with these things, you want to enter them in film festivals.
Yeah.
That takes a while, that whole process. And then they have to premiere there, et cetera. And then you're looking for the right premiere date that fits into your schedule and that, where you'll get the most impact, the most eyeballs. We've got another one that's coming up in just a few weeks on Danny Hurley, where we've been spending a lot of time with the UConn program and Danny Hurley this season. And we really just started shooting that, a couple of months ago. But it also, there's also stuff from a story that I produced on Danny Hurley in 1993 or 1994 when he was playing at Seton Hall, when he quit the team to deal with some emotional struggles that he was dealing with at that point. So you find yourself when you've been doing this long enough, and at this point I've been at ESPN, this is 32 years, coming back and seeing a lot of people again, and then you're looking for new stuff. We have one coming up on Scott Pollard, who I'd never met before, who underwent a heart transplant not long ago, which is another interesting medical-based story. But it can vary. It's definitely changed though. In the early years of E60, there was a lot more quick turnaround. And that was just based on the show was different. It was a magazine format show. We do 3 or 4 pieces per show rather than one story per show. And we would do sometimes up to like 20 weeks in a row of shows. So, something falls through, something doesn't happen, somebody decides they don't want to participate, then you're scrambling, and we turn around. That first Gunnar Esiason piece, that was on in the first season, for instance. I think we shot that on a Saturday and it aired on a Tuesday. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. So do you like the way that it's evolved?
I do. I mean, I like both of those things, right? And I still get to do it with other pieces that we do that air for other shows.
Yeah.
But I like the immediacy. I like the quick turn. I mean, that's what, I came from originally. Well, that's basically what everybody comes from originally, right? Or most people do, not from, these super long format, hour-long shows. But, to have the opportunity to do as many of these as we do in the world of sports, it's really a privilege, where you're never worried about, am I going to have enough time to tell this story? If typically you've got 48 minutes or more to do it. And some of them are longer. I think Abbott is going to be whatever the 90 minutes, 90 minutes on linear and whatever it ends up being on Plus. So, it's become so much more sophisticated, the storytelling at ESPN. It's become so much more cinematic. It's not the stuff that I was doing or anybody else at the network was doing 25, 30 years ago. And you go back and you look, and we did some great stories, don't get me wrong, back then. The network, we had great producers, great reporters, great correspondents, but it's like everything else, it evolves and it becomes, as I said, more sophisticated, more cinematic, more moving parts. I mean, when I think about the Pat Tillman doc that we did that aired in November, that was another one that was probably over the course of about a year that we planned it, went out and did all the fresh interviews with members of the platoon, with Pat's mother, Danny, but, with the other key figures in the documentary. But again, it also relied on reporting that had been taking place over the course of the last 20 years from Willie Weinbaum and Mike Fish and John Barr.
How did the Sports Reporters revival come about? Is that something that you were pushing for, or was it just kind of pitched to you?
The way I remember it, I mean, basically from the time the show went off the air, I was saying, oh, we should bring it back. We should bring it back almost from that point. And, for me, it's obviously personal in a way that it isn't for most people.
Yeah.
But the show was such a big part of my life. And it's one of those things you always heard about, like people would say, what happened to Sports Reporters? Why can't we bring back the Sports Reporters? And so I pushed for it, and Norby was behind it. It was right around this time 2 years ago when he said, we're bringing it back. And I was obviously very excited. And, ESPN is big. It's like turning around a battleship, right? So it takes a while after something like that to actually get it up and running and get, the graphics and get the studio and get budgets and all that kind of stuff in place. But yeah, I was thrilled, with the announcement. I love the show. I think there's a place for it. I think there's a lot of affection for it out there still. And also, at this time, it's really, it's a show that has roots that go back 37 years now, something like that. But it's also a work in progress. And it's clearly, not the old Sports Reporters. Although, format, how much different is it really? Not that much different. But, things change. And mostly we've been doing it virtually with people in boxes, which is not my preference, but it's just, it's just much easier to get people in boxes. Here we are in boxes, right? And it's fun to watch the evolution. And we're really in this stage now where we're kind of like trying different things, trying different guests, trying different panel mixes, how they work with each other. And it's just a totally different world. I kind of hate to keep referring to myself as a dinosaur, but, I come from a world where, there were barely ratings for these things, right? Like, I don't think they had minute by minutes or anything like that. Like they had like a show rating for half hour. And now it's like, you can see how many views you got. You can see who's watching this, what clip they're watching, for how long they're watching, all this stuff that's, obvious to the digital generation. But, the Sports Reporters was on all those years. Basically, it's like, yeah, the ratings are pretty good. And, we think this is what people like, and we do it. And now we have the ability with all this data to really drill down on it and figure it out. And so, you do that to a certain extent, and then you also do what you just think is the best show. Yeah. And it's, and sometimes those things are the same and sometimes they're not.
How do you think the virtual dynamic has been? Like, are panelists, do you find that they're able to feed off of each other similarly and have the discussions?
They are, but it is, technically it's harder because, we're working on it. We literally had a meeting a few days ago about how we, reduce the delay between the different panelists so that there is more of a natural flow, right? The way that you would have in studio. And the way to, I'm the last person who should be talking about the technical aspects of any of this stuff. But there are ways to do it. I think generally you're going to sacrifice some of the video and audio quality. And when you're, when you come from, when I was a kid, before I was working there, but as a kid, I remember them, using film on TV, right? Like the news was cut, the mesh bags with the film in it. And one thing that was always kind of the holy grail was perfect video, perfect audio. And here we are all these decades later, right? Where those things which you thought would just keep getting better, we actually don't care as much about, right? Like it doesn't have to be high def in these kinds of discussions or on the Sports Reporters or whatever it might be. And what really matters in, I guess this is something that we should be encouraged by is the content. So, we're figuring that stuff out. But yeah, we did one in studio, which was fun for me. We did back-to-back shows in December on 2 days. We did one on the college football playoffs, which was great. And we had Ryan McGee, Nicole Auerbach, Josh Pate, and Paul Feinbaum. And, that was virtual. And they really, they know each other. And I think they all know each other. And they really played well off of each other. So it really worked well. And the next day we did it in studio with Bill Roden and Hannah Storm and Trey Wingo, who are all veterans of the old Sports Reporters, especially Bill, but the others as well, Hannah and Trey. And for me as the host, sitting there, and you can tap somebody, on the shoulder, you can make eye contact, you can do all these things with body language to indicate where you're going. You can really have a different level of interaction with each other. That's great. But that's, you're going to limit yourself in terms of the people you can get into the studio.
What was being part of the old version, like working on it and even just being around it?
Oh, it was great. I was in college when the show went on the air, and my father started hosting it. And mostly because I did not have the most exciting social life, I guess. I'd spend a lot of early Sunday mornings in the studios with the guys, as they were prepping to do the show. Mitch, Mike, Bob, Bill, my dad, spending Sunday mornings there was like a formative thing for me, being around all the sports reporters who would come in and do it. They did it first in a studio on 57th Street on the west side of Manhattan. Then they did it at the HBO studios, believe it or not, for years and years and years. And then they moved it to the ESPN zone when the zone opened in like 1999 or whatever it was. And by that point, I was occasionally on the show as a guest, occasionally filling in as a host. And then there were Sports Reporters 2. I mean, there were so many different iterations. There was Sports Reporters 2, which Jack Ford hosted, which was fun, which was like a primetime version of it. And I was on that a lot. And then I ended up hosting a lot over the years during the John Saunders era, whenever John had other responsibilities. I would do it frequently. Mike did it more than me, Lupica, but I did it quite a bit. And then there was another show that I hosted called Classic Sports Reporters, which isn't as well remembered as I wish it was, which we did on ESPN Classic. But it was, for me as a kid in my late 20s at that point, early 30s, I was hosting this show on ESPN Classic, which took the Sports Reporters format and talked about the history of sports, great moments in the history of sports. And we did party shots and all that, but I was sitting there with, Woody Broon and Kurt Gowdy and Jack Whitaker. And basically, and we did Jerry Eisenberg. I mean, we could go on and on. We did, I think it was exactly 100 shows. And it was Mark Shapiro's creation. And I got to host it. And it was like getting, a PhD in sports history and sports journalism history, sitting next to those guys. So, for me, the Sports Reporters is obviously a deep connection.
Were you ever encouraged by ESPN, whether earlier in your career or later in your career,
leave the network? Many times.
No. But to stick to sports more? Like, were you ever told not to cover a story because of a topic that it ventured into?
No, and it's really been for me, over the course of it looked like it's evolved. We didn't do as many, when I got to ESPN, as I said, it was different. We didn't have these shows, right? I mean, Outside the Lines went on the air, I think in 90. And the first thing I did was work on Outside the Lines in '93 on a special on sports gambling. And that's always been, a big part of my role, is working on, if you want to just call it, the serious side of sports, right? So, over the years, as different people have been in charge of content or production or the news side, the message to me has always been, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Keep doing what you're doing. And so I think that's, that's what I'm associated with largely. And it's been a great ride, and I hope it continues for a long time, because I'm 55 and I've got 3 kids I still have to put through college. So my hope is the model holds up for a while and we keep doing this kind of stuff. And it's interesting. Part of it is too, right? Perception. I mean, especially starting 5 years ago, when the pandemic hit. I mean, we were doing those segments on Outside the Lines every day. Well, 5 days a week on SportsCenter, an hour show every Saturday, right? And we were dealing with the heaviest, most serious, most, you could say, sports topics that transcended sports more than ever before, all the time.
Yeah.
Like every day, are they going to play? Aren't they going to play? Social justice issues as well, with the murder of George Floyd. I mean, it was, serious stuff at a volume that I don't think we'd ever done before. And I was very proud of the work that we did, especially during that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, there is always so much discussion around the stick to sports and the stick to sports mandate, particularly over the last 7 to 10 years or so, I'd say. But meanwhile, you have kind of touched on those issues that, like you said, transcend sports for decades. And I think
that's what we've done. I think the best work that I've been a part of, I would say the network has done, the best work that I've been a part of has been about those issues, the intersection of sports and society, globally, domestically. I mentioned earlier, the stuff that we did on Qatar and the World Cup, the stuff that we did on FIFA, stuff that we did in South Africa before the World Cup in 2010, about homophobia there, stuff that we did in South Asia, specifically in Bhopal, with the effects of, the lasting effects of the worst industrial disaster of all time, the Bhopal Union Carbide chemical plant leak. It's heavy, right? And it is, again, a privilege to be able to do that kind of work. And I go back to, as a young guy in the business, 24 years old in 1993, and I'd spent a year working at Time Warner, Time Life. I had worked in local TV in New York. And if you'd pick one place where you could go in the world of journalism at that point and reporting to do, serious stuff all over the world for the next several decades, as so much of this industry would contract. And, I just got very lucky to be at this place where we've done so much of it.
Does it seem like, in your opinion, does sports media prioritize journalism enough?
The sports media, or the people who cover sports media? Because those are two different things, right? Sports media. I would certainly say, if you're going to look at this, and I do consider myself somewhat of a historian of sports journalism. Yeah. In the books I've written, dealt with that to a large extent as well. The giants of the business from the golden age, as they called it, of the 1930s, the Frank Grahams and the Grantland Rices and the Red Smiths, all these people. If you go back and you look at the way the world of sports was covered, really prior to the last 50 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, going back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement, it was avoided at all costs. You didn't want to talk about the serious side of sports. And I don't want to get this wrong, but I think, when Jackie Robinson debuted in 1947 with the Dodgers after spending the year in Montreal, almost 2 years after signing, right, with Brandt Rickey at Brandt Rickey's office in Brooklyn, I think the New York Times story covering his debut, was it April 15th, 47, doesn't mention that he's the first, that he's broken the color line. So I think there is much more emphasis on the serious side, the ways in which sport reflects so much of society now than there probably ever has been before. But there are places that do it and places that don't do it. But if you're looking for it now, you can find it.
Yeah. Just maybe doesn't get platformed the same way as some other content does. What type of sports coverage do you consume?
That's a good question. I watch, a lot of our shows. I listen to sports talk radio sometimes. A lot of it depends for me on what I happen to be working on in that moment. If I'm doing a college football show with Pate and Feinbaum and Auerbach and McGee, I might spend a lot more time that week listening to college football shows than I do normally in my life as kind of a college football agnostic, who grew up in New York City. But as there are big issues that kind of arise, I pay more attention. I'm not, it used to be a religious thing to read the sports sections of several newspapers every day.
Yeah.
And I still have digital subscriptions to a bunch of them. And I try to, do that. I try to, read what I see in my Times app, in my Journal app, in my Washington Post app, USA Today, all of that. I don't consume as much of I don't even know what, like the stuff that the younger people on our staff, what they're always consuming and the people they know about. I frankly don't know as much about, I am, again, kind of old school. But, there is great content out there. It's hard sifting through all of it, right?
Yeah.
And finding what you really want to focus on. And it's hard. I spend so much time listening to the Rest is History podcast. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
The guys. Yeah. That there's very little time left in my life for anything outside of Dom and Tom, but I try.
I'm curious if you have an opinion on how the Pat McAfee, Aaron Rodgers discussions fit on ESPN.
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Obviously, it's not the way I've approached things over the years when I've talked about Aaron Rodgers. But having that platform, I understand the idea that there is value in having Aaron Rodgers on our platform, right?
Yeah.
Talking about these things. It generates a huge amount of news.
Yeah.
It's a different approach from the way I talk to him, but I'm not getting Aaron Rodgers to talk to me anymore. We once, that might have been a possibility, but things, it's just different, and I often think about this in terms of my career. I always approached it from an attitude like, these are the questions you have to ask. These are the topics you have to broach. These are the things that you can't let the person in the chair get out of the chair from without asking them and without following up on, right? And, I did an Aaron Rodgers profile back in whatever that was, right after he won the Super Bowl. So we spent a lot of time together. I went out to Milwaukee like the next year to host his charity dinner, that kind of stuff. So I know Aaron Rodgers, right? But in the course of the job that I'm doing over the years, there are times when you end up being critical, right? When you're talking about things. And I'm not saying that Pat doesn't cover that stuff. I think he does. I'm not the most avid viewer. The first time I saw the show was the show a couple of years ago when Aaron Rodgers basically said, I'm heading to the Jets. I remember sitting there watching that because I was doing like the Outside the Line segment or that day or the next day about Rodgers. So I needed to know what was going on. And I was just like, oh my God, he's sitting here. I think it was like 80 minutes. Aaron Rodgers just kept talking about what he was going to do. And I was like, this is insane. With all due respect, who has time to listen to Aaron Rodgers for 80 minutes? But I guess most of the world does, right? Because the views are huge.
Yeah.
But, I've often thought about this, right? Like, I always considered my role like the serious guy, asking the tough questions, asking the tough follow-ups. And, we've evolved to the point in the world of sports, right, where the people who you want to talk to, they have options. They have different people to talk to. They have platforms where, they can say their piece. They're going to get asked questions. And it's a different temperature, right? It's a different temperature the way it was like sitting down with Larry King or sitting down with Mike Wallace, right? There's a difference. And you could say they both bring value in different ways. And again, I'm going back to guys who now, if they were alive, would be about 100. It's just a different way of doing things. And it's clearly working, right? I mean,
yeah.
The success is just, so impressive. And, I guess my point is like, if I called Aaron Rodgers now to sit down with me, even though we have that history back there, he's not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I had deep relationships with a lot of people that I covered over the years, but, eventually when, for whatever reason, they ran into some difficulties and they knew I was going to ask them difficult questions about it, they tended to be more reluctant to sit down again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't really blame Pat so much. I think he has a way of conducting those interviews or conversations with Aaron Rodgers that he's established years before going to ESPN.
Right.
But I do think like Pat almost has to realize that now when those conversations are put on a platform like ESPN, you have to be willing to accept any backlash that comes with it. So like, don't change what you're doing. That's fine. If you guys have a way of talking and having those conversations.
You mean like the reaction to it, right?
But yeah, you kind of have to accept the reaction and
people are going to react. People, when you have a huge platform, and I learned that at a very young age, right? And it was a different world back then. There was no social media, and it's changed. But when you did a report, on SportsCenter, and there was only SportsCenter, right? There weren't all these other options. You knew that whatever you said, however you said it, whatever tie you wore was going to be scrutinized, right? And that's another thing I think about. I was very fortunate, I think, to come up in this business at a time when there was no social media, when it didn't exist yet. And I think I would have just, crawled under a rock if I had to deal with it as I was getting my footing in the business and learning how to do things. That constant feedback, I think it has a very adverse effect on people's mental health, for athletes, for people in the media. I think it can reinforce the wrong lessons. I mean, look, I'm sure, feedback is good, but kind of the mob mentality of social media, I don't think it's good. I mean, that's, I used to talk to school, college students and stuff and say, stay off social media, don't do it, do your job, don't worry about the reactions, but it's just not realistic. We don't live in that world anymore. I feel fortunate that I think I've been kind of grandfathered in, and maybe to my own detriment, I don't engage as much as I could. I hardly engage at all. And maybe I should have figured out a way to be a social media influencer, or, somebody who has that presence. But I think it would just,
I would advise against it.
It's too late. It's definitely too late. But there was a moment in time, like when I got on Twitter in 2009, and some people were like, where it's like everything you do, every reaction, every game, all of that stuff. And then you could have built up, a bigger following. And then you think, well, maybe it was best that I didn't, because I'm not institutionalized. Not yet.
Do you have any, I don't know if regret is the right word, but like, is there a story that you missed on during your career, or like a report that you would have liked to have a do-over on in retrospect?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a few, but when I think about, there's certainly things that you don't see coming, where it's just like you don't have a crystal ball. You'd like that. That's different. But I think having been the guy who was covering the McGuire-Sosa home run race in '98,
okay, yeah,
and then having been the guy who covered Lance Armstrong's 3 of his last 4 Tours de France. Look, I will say I did a ton of stories about, steroids and performance enhancers, and, asked Lance those questions, about the saddle sores and all that kind of stuff, if we're going to get into the nitty gritty. But clearly, after the confessions from Mr. McGuire, from Lance Armstrong, after all of that, there should have been even more skepticism expressed. At the same time, these were things that we talked about, and in the absence of positive tests, right? Although they weren't even testing if you can't talk about positive tests. That wasn't until 5-6 years later. But just what we were seeing, if I could go back to 1998, 28-year-old me covering that home run race, and how enthusiastic we all were about it, and I was, and the Andro moment, again, if we're going to get into the granular parts of it, where oh, Andro, does that really count as a steroid? And we were all being hoodwinked. Yeah, I wish I had found a way to tell the true story even at that time. Because the true story was not what we were reporting, as we found out years later. And that applies to many of the stars of the steroids era in baseball, and certainly to Lance Armstrong.
So were you skeptical at the time in 1998, like when watching Sammy Sosa and Mark McGuire simultaneously shatter the record, or was like the Andro like enough to like be like an explainer?
I don't remember. I will say, I was certainly skeptical about Lance Armstrong.
Yeah.
As anyone was who covered the sport at that time. You couldn't not be, and the drugs were too effective to do that. But with Mark and with Sammy that summer, I remember seeing Mark. Mark was huge. Mark was huge. What did I know about bodybuilding or anything like that? I'm sure part of me was skeptical. And I'm sure part of me was innocent until proved guilty.
Yeah. So having covered that in 1998 and then covering Lance, what was there anything you learned from covering the 1998 home run chase that you took with you to then covering Lance?
Well, you got to remember, I think cycling was different, right? The sport had been so thoroughly corrupted for so long. By performance-enhancing drugs, by EPO in particular, that you had to have a skepticism about it. And yet at the same time, Lance was so adamant, right? And he was so confrontational with those who suggested that he was cheating. And not only confrontational, litigious. And it was, I remember having conversations with friends of mine in the business, frankly, right? Who were like, Lance would never, ever do that after what he went through with his battle with cancer. There's no way he would put that stuff in the body. And I remember having that same discussion with people I knew about McGuire when Canseco wrote the book, who were supporters, champions of his, who said there's no way that he would let Jose Canseco inject him with that kind of stuff. And I certainly was skeptical. But again, when, the Cycling Federation said, nope, he's never tested positive. He's tested every day. He's the most tested person on the planet, all that kind of stuff. There are limits to what you can say, responsibly as a journalist, because there's some things you just don't know. And it was a very sophisticated doping program. It was very well covered up for a very long time. And if you were to get on the air and say something along the lines of, what these guys do is so hard, it's so grueling, it's so taxing, and we know that EPO has blood dope, all these other things have had, such a profound effect on the performance of certain riders, that you can't possibly do these things so much better when you're clean than people who are cheating, right? Is that a responsible thing to do? I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah. Did you ever cover anything else other than sports earlier in your career? Like, I know Stephen A. Smith, for example, was a crime reporter very early on when he was getting started, or was it always sports for you?
So it wasn't when I worked in local news in New York. So I worked my first year out of school. I was technically a Sports Illustrated employee, but I was basically working on projects for the international edition of Time, these special advertising sections about the 92 Olympics, both Olympics, Albertville and Barcelona. And then that was a one-year project. And then I went to work for the Time Warner-owned New York One TV station in New York, which, if you live in the city, people are familiar with. 24-hour cable news station. It was kind of the first of its kind, not the first 24-hour cable news station, but the first where it was, the one-man band. You're shooting your own stuff, you're editing your own stuff. The reporters, are going out there. And I wasn't a reporter. I was one level down from that. I think they called us desk assistants. So my job every day was to come in at 5 p.m. and grab a camera bag with tapes in it and batteries and a tripod, and go out in one of our fleet of Chevrolet Cavaliers with New York press plates and drive around the city all night before cell phones. I think they gave us beepers, and we had like two-way radios in the car, and go from different news event to different news event. So it was a lot of crime scenes. It was a lot of political events. That's that's most of what constituted local news in the early 90s in New York City. And then if it was a slow night in news, if I wasn't at, station house for a perp walk or something like that, or talking to detectives and eyewitnesses at a crime scene, or at some political dinner with Rudy Giuliani, who was running for mayor at that point, or David Dinkins, who was running for re-election at that point, if it was kind of slow, then I'd get to spend like the last 2 hours of the shift doing sports stuff, going to, one of the stadiums or arenas or college venues, and getting some sports sound and bringing it back to the station at the corner of 42nd and 10th. But it was, I went into it thinking I want to be a news guy, and I don't think I want to do sports anymore. And, over the course of that time there, I just kept gravitating back to the sports department, doing sports stories, being around the sports guys, being around the teams. It was an exciting time to cover sports in New York. And also, there is a certain grimness, right, to local news.
Yeah.
Again, there were things I still remember. I think I was one of the first reporters on the scene at the Long Island Railroad shooting that happened at that time. I think it was 14 people killed, 14 people shot by Colin Ferguson. I remember being down there that night, the first World Trade Center bombing in 93, what that was like. I remember there are a few crime stories in particular. I remember there was one horrific crime story up in the Bronx where like a whole family got wiped out, some kind of drug thing, and shooting the perp walk. And it was it was a lot of grim stuff, and I just kept kind of gravitating back to sports at that point, and got some opportunities to produce for ESPN on a freelance basis, and then to write for CBS Sports. And so I left the job. I quit the job to go work at the Lillehammer Olympics for CBS, which was a great opportunity. And I was doing freelance stuff for ESPN at that point, and I was able to make it work, doing stuff for NBC Sports, CBS Sports, both of them as a writer, and then producing for ESPN. And then I went full-time at ESPN.
And did you ever have, once you got into ESPN and really got into sports, did you ever have any thoughts about going back and being a news guy?
There were times when I thought about it, and I'm trying to think, if I ended up doing any of those kinds of stories for ABC News, because at one point I was doing a lot of stuff for Nightline. It was right before Monday Night Football came to ESPN. When Monday Night Football was still on ABC and Nightline would follow it, they would do a lot of sports because they knew they had that built-in sports audience. And I think the numbers they told me at that point, again, I don't know, what is this, 20 plus years ago, most nights, Nightline, I think, was 60-40 women. And Monday nights, it was 60-40 men because of the Monday Night Football lead-in. So I was doing a lot of stories for them, which were tangentially sports or all sports. I was thinking that, maybe I'll get some opportunities to do some more news stuff. Or at one point when I was a producer at ESPN, I talked to ABC, where my father was still working at that point, about doing international news reporting. I think it was at the time of the wars going on in the Balkans, but they just kind of laughed me out of the room.
It's incredible to think that your dad died. I mean, it's almost going on a quarter century, it'll be 24 years in the fall.
Yeah.
And cause just his voice still is so entrenched in everybody, all sports fans' brains forever. But it's almost like, it's like a silly question to ask, what was it like going through that when he died? Cause obviously it was devastating, but just the fact that it did come unexpectedly and then kind of living that out in the public, is it helpful that people were probably just giving tributes to your father and there you are living it yourself and wanting to kind of to cope in your own way, but you're also having to see so many public messages about it. Does that make it harder, or is that help?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I mean, it was obviously, very difficult, and for all of us. And he was very young. He was 66 when he went in the hospital. And it was one of those things you just don't expect, a hip replacement surgery going awry. And we were, really close, especially at that time in our lives. We were hosting a radio show together. We were working at the same place. We were, we were with each other and around each other constantly. He was my closest friend. So it was devastating. Would it have been easier to deal with if it wasn't something people were talking about all the time? Would it have been harder? I think it's both, right? There's the public nature of it and dealing with that, and people you don't know expressing their sympathy, which on one level is comforting, and on another level, sometimes it's hard to constantly revisit things, or even in that moment, because he was in the hospital for 13 weeks fighting it, and it was kind of public. But I appreciate all those moments. I remember some specific moments from people coming up to me on the street and saying how much they cared about my father, how much they were rooting for him. I remember that time going out interviewing Magic Johnson for something that was going on, going out to Lansing or East Lansing, and the message that he wanted to communicate. Joe Torre, the same thing during the playoffs that year. So, I mean, you have those moments, and I can't say I don't appreciate not just the famous people, right? I remember when he died, the two figures in the world of sports who I didn't really know, who reached out to me, and I'll never forget it, right? Were Wayne Gretzky and Bernie Williams. And that's just something you'll always remember. Somehow they found my number, and then other people who, obviously a lot of people who I was friendly with. And then I still have it somewhere in my office. I've got a box, like one of these like banker's boxes that's filled. It's got to be about 1,000, maybe more, beautiful condolence letters from people, and only a few of them, are from people I know.
Yeah.
I remember Maria Shriver, I've never met, sent me a book about coping with grief. People did incredibly generous, warm-hearted things, and I'll always be grateful for that. So yeah, it's nice to know so many people loved your dad. But it's also hard because every person you see knows that you're dealing with something, and it's just, so they're talking to you and being around you in a way that they wouldn't if they didn't know your personal situation. And I'm sure I was not fun to be around. I remember going to the Olympics a few weeks after that, the Salt Lake Olympics. It was only maybe 5-6 weeks after he died. And I remember, obviously anybody would be in a bad state. I just remember being, people were, kind of, at arm's length, just want to give you your space, which I appreciate, but it's, there's an awkwardness to it.
Yeah, sure. The Bob Knight interview, that was the year prior. Your dad was alive for that, right?
He was.
Did he give you any feedback after that interview? What were his thoughts on that?
So his thoughts were really best captured. He did his parting shot that week about it. I think the interview was a Monday night. Maybe it was a Tuesday night, a Monday or a Tuesday night. And then his parting shot that week really told the story. He was very proud. He was pissed off at Bob. That was, one of those weeks that you don't get many weeks like in your career, right? Where it's like, everybody's talking about what you're doing, the work that you're doing, the job that you've done. I mean, it's literally, the banner headline on the back page of the New York Post was Schaap aces night test. Okay. So, you'll get a lot of moments like that, and I was 31. I just turned 31. And so you think, oh, this is what it's going to be like all the time, right? It's going to be like this forever. Then it takes a few years to realize there aren't a lot of moments like that. But in terms of my father, and that he really summed it up, and he told a nice story, about some guy stopping him on the street and talking about it. And it sounds self-serving, but what he said in the parting shot was, he said, this guy stopping on the street, he says, "Hey, Knight's wrong about your kid. He's already better than you." That was like his favorite part of it. And he really reveled in that whole moment because it was just exciting stuff. It was a big deal. It was the one guy everybody wanted to talk to, and you got him in the chair and it was live. You never do that. And it, turned out to be kind of confrontational. And what my dad said was, I couldn't have done that interview. That's not the way I could do it. And part of what I think was special about it was that I was so young, that I wasn't, but somebody who had a ton of experience. And then, you would have played it differently. I might have been more defensive. It was confrontational without, I think I was never defensive.
Yeah.
And that's different. I remember, talking to Bob Costas about it shortly thereafter. He was down, I keep coming back to the Olympics, strangely, but he was down in Australia for the Sydney Olympics at that point. And I talked to him on the phone and maybe email, whatever it was. He said, "You know what? You should have told him when he said, you've got a long way to go to be as good as your dad. You should have said, well, you've got a long way to go to be as good as Dean Smith." And I was thinking to myself, that's the perfect thing for Bob Costas to say. Yeah. At that point in his career, right? As the guy.
Well established. Yeah.
For me, that would have been exactly the wrong thing to say. Right? Just say, "Thank you, Bob. Let's move on." Because I was just a kid, right? Yeah. Even if you make it personal, I didn't want the focus to be on me.
What was your internal reaction during that interview when Bob Knight says that you got a long way to go before you're as good as your dad?
Well, it's hard to remember like exactly in the moment, but I mean, you got to remember, it was just a very unusual situation, right? To be doing this live. Again, those things don't happen. Where like, all those big interviews, they're on tape and people have time to edit it and do this and do that and whatever it might be in the world of sports or elsewhere. This is like, we're on the clock, right? And he's filibustering. And one of my closest friends is longtime ESPN producer Willie Weinbaum. And he'd said, he's going to say something about your dad to throw you off when during this interview. He'd said, and Willie, it said that's going to be part of it. And I'll always remember because it was Willie's 40th birthday. It was September 12th, 2000. And I don't know if that was in the back of my mind the whole time, but really my strategy was like, okay, Bob Knight's insulted me, get in line, and he'd done it before. I've talked about this before. I'd interviewed him in a one-on-one setting, I think only once before, and it had been at New York One. And so this was 7 years earlier, something like that. And he was in New York for the Big Apple Invitational. And he very generously gave this kid reporter at a local news station a one-on-one interview. And of course, I thought it was like the Frost Nixon interview, right? Like I was going to, get to the bottom of whatever was going on with Bob Knight. I'm 22 and, I'm not approaching it as like, here's a nice little interview. What's it like to be in New York, Bob? How's your team playing? I'm like, your comportment over the years, that kind of stuff. I'm doing, like too much, right? So at one point, I think I'm asking him about how he's matured, and now he sees like he's lost his patience. And he says to me, I think the exact words were, "You were doing very well up until now, green over your head." And starts taking the mic out from under the red sweater. I remember exactly where I was. I was on the mezzanine of the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Times Square. And I'm like, that's pretty good. I mean, because, it's supremely condescending, but he was also kind of right. And so I've been there before with Bob Knight, right? Just not with millions of people watching.
Were you surprised that he was willing to do that interview? Because it was like less than a week after he was fired.
It was like 3 days. And I had been there earlier in the week. I had gone there. This is great. So I'm up in Wisconsin covering, I'm in Madison covering a Wisconsin football story. And really the way it all happened is I just happened to be the person closest to Bloomington. And so I get a phone call from Chuck Salaturo, who was running the news division of ESPN at that time. And it's irrelevant, but he'd been the sports editor of the Milwaukee Journal. And he says, all right, we've mapped it all out. You're the closest person to Bloomington. This is on Friday after it looks like they're going to fire him. And he's having a press conference down at Assembly Hall. He said, you're the closest person to Bloomington. We're gonna get you a private plane to get down there because the drive's like 7 hours. It's the only way you'll make the press conference. Just go to the airport, go to the Madison airport, and a jet will be fueling up by the time you arrive. We just have to get final permission from Bob Iger's office. And at that time, he was the number 2 guy in Disney, and you could not get a private plane, or at least we couldn't, without his permission. But they said, it's 10 minutes, just go. So I show up, it's like, it's the closest I've ever felt to like James Bond, right? I show up at the airport in Madison, and there's this beautiful little jet, and I'm the only passenger, and there are the 2 pilots, and I think it's 44 minutes takeoff to touchdown from Madison to Bloomington. And I get to Assembly Hall, and he has this wild press conference, and he's like, I didn't do it. I didn't do anything wrong. Ken Harvey, he didn't say that he didn't touch him, but basically it looked like the whole thing would die down. So they say, okay, go back to Madison. So the next morning, and it couldn't be more different from my experience the day before, I catch a bus from Bloomington to Indianapolis, and then I have to fly Northwest Indianapolis to Detroit to Madison to get back for the game. And then the shit hits the fan again, and there are the protests on campus and Miles Brand fires and all that, and then they send me back down. And then I do the
How do you prepare for a potentially combative interview? Because there is such like an impulse to be defensive, especially if somebody is saying something that's meant to be insulting to you?
Well, you start with the questions, right? And everybody was all in on the process, right? I was not preparing by myself. I remember several people were involved in the process. It was Chuck, it was Bob Eaton, it was Vince Doria, Mark Shapiro, Mike Lupa gave me advice. My father gave me advice. My father gave me probably the least valuable advice. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was just like so far out of his experience of like doing things that, Mark and Mike and Vince and Bob, they kind of had a better handle on like the way this should be approached because of what this was and what the moment was. And because the previous interview had not gone the way that they had hoped for with Bob that ESPN did a few months earlier and before he was fired. And Norby came in, Norby produced from the truck. And then I remember, so I did all the preparation. Thing you want to do is like, it wasn't really situational. Like, how do I react? It was all about the questions, and that's what I always say to myself. I think I might have mentioned before, when somebody sits down in that chair, the thing I try to say to myself, what are the questions you have to ask that you can't let them out of the chair? You can't let them out of the chair until you ask these questions. And so that was it. Knowing the questions, knowing the issues, knowing the possible follow-ups that you're going to ask in the event that, there is an attempt to filibuster or ignore the premise of the question. And that was really it. And then at a certain point, Bob Eaton gave me some really good advice. He said, you know what, you've prepared, you're really well prepared. Stop preparing. Just go relax, go take a shower, go take a nap. We're doing this at like 7 p.m. and just, you're fine. You can over prepare too. Yeah. You hype yourself up too much. And it felt like, again, something else, the closest I'm ever going to come to something that feels like a boxing match or a heavyweight. Yeah. I mean, and that's the way it was covered. It was at this remote venue that we found far away from campus. That was intentional. And when I showed up, there were satellite trucks, not ours, from all these other entities covering the interview as an event. Yeah. Like state troopers everywhere. It was insane. And all day Digger Phelps, and it was all Digger who arranged the interview. Bob did it for Digger. And, or did it because of Digger's influence. He did it for himself. He thought it was important to get out there. And all day, Digger had been calling me, asking me to come meet with Bob. And I thought that was a bad idea. So I avoided Bob all day. Yeah. I did not want to establish any kind of pre-interview rapport. Because I knew he would take that moment to try to establish ground rules or this or that. And so I've been avoiding him all day. And then, Bob Lee was in Bristol and Bob threw it to me and, we just took it from there.
Did you have interactions with Bob Knight in the years after? I mean, obviously he ended up working at ESPN later.
Well, few very limited ones. By the following year, he was coaching at Texas Tech and they were having some success and they sent me out to Oklahoma. And frankly, this wasn't a decision that I agreed with. They wanted me to cover, I think it was an Oklahoma Texas Tech game. I didn't really want to be there. I didn't really want to have to cover him at that point. After what had happened, I thought, we kind of said to each other all that needed to be said, but I did. And I think, I don't know if I honestly don't remember if I asked a question in the press conference or I didn't, but then there were a couple of occasions over the years. I remember once I was in Vegas covering a story. I have no idea what it was, but it was tournament time. And I get out of the airport, I get out of McCarran, and the first thing I see is one of those giant Vegas billboards. And it's like, and I'm staying at the Wynn, I think. And it's like all week long or all weekend long, tournament, first weekend of the tournament, Billy Packer and Bob Knight holding court at the Wynn. And I'm like, oh, God. I'm like, all right, well, it's like, I think it's the fourth biggest hotel in the world, something like that at that point. Like, I'm never going to see him.
You should be able to avoid him.
Cab pulls up. Who's standing there? Walking through the casino the next night, talking to an ESPN producer. whose presence do I feel? Like literally feel it before I see him or hear him behind me. Bob coming up to talk to the producer. I'm like, oh my God. No, I never saw him in the cafeteria in Bristol, but I did. And then we ended up having same agent, Sandy Montag.
Okay.
Sandy was very close to Bob and to his wife, Karen. And so look, the Bob thing is interesting. I should always be grateful that he gave me that opportunity, as well as ESPN.
Yeah. Last thing, I know you've obviously covered Mike Tyson a lot throughout your career. What were your thoughts on the Mike Tyson Jake Paul fight?
I didn't watch, and I wouldn't have watched. I didn't watch. What was the Roy Jones? I just look. I respect the sport a lot. I do. I think what boxers do, what prize fighters do, is the hardest thing in sports. It takes incredible commitment. It takes physical courage to get in there. I have a great appreciation for the history of sport. I wrote a history of the heavyweight division, basically, my book, Cinderella Man, up to that point. If there's one person I've interviewed the most in my career by far, by a factor of probably 3 or 4, it's Mike Tyson. And the last time I interviewed him in person, I've seen him since. Last time I interviewed him in person was out in Vegas after he wrote one of his recent books and asked him about being sexually abused as a kid. He was in so much pain. He could barely move. He was just about to have back surgery or just had back surgery. I mean, he couldn't move. So for me, the idea of Mike at 58 getting into a ring, and, it's his prerogative, right? And he got licensed, whatever it was. And, and money is money. But I couldn't help but feel that it's sad. I just wasn't interested in any way in the proceedings. And so those are my feelings. A 58-year-old guy with a bad back, who hasn't won a big fight in 36 years. That's not my idea of like great sports event.
Yeah. What was the toughest interview of your career? Maybe it was Bob Knight, or was there another one that stands out, even if it wasn't something that's on camera?
I wish I had a bigger oeuvre, but when I really think about the ones that I'll never forget, there's Bob Knight, and it's not a sit-down interview, but the moments I spent with Bobby Fischer at a press conference in Iceland in 2005, asking him questions. And then again, it got confrontational and all of that. Those moments, if you're lucky, right, you have a few of them in your career where there's a moment where you're talking to somebody and somebody with an important story to be told, and you've got the opportunity that other people don't have to ask them questions and to be in those moments. But I think about Bob Knight and I think about Bobby Fischer. There's certainly a lot of interviews that I've done over the years with political leaders, military leaders, et cetera, where you're getting into important issues, difficult issues. And the stakes for those stories are very high. But in terms of like kind of a moment that you'll never forget, those two stand out. I mean, I should say the Manti Te'o interview was another one of those kinds of moments. I mean, that was surreal in so many ways. And again, that was off camera. And trust me, I wish it had been on camera. We tried very hard to get it on camera. And that was one of the remarkable things too. Like there were people at the time, this is why I don't look at social media, which I literally didn't look at for 2 or 3 weeks after that, like deleted all that stuff. Like if you really want to grow followers, I'm going in to do an interview with the guy that everybody in the world is talking about right now. I don't think I posted one thing about it, definitely didn't post anything about it and then just got rid of it. But if you go back and you listen, everything that Manti Te'o told me, and we published, I think, the full transcript of that, like 2.5 hours, all these years later, nothing he said has been disproven. My feeling was talking to him for those hours, and you never want to be in that position, right? It's unnatural as a journalist where you're being asked to vouch for someone's honesty. truthfulness, right? We're here to ask them questions, and then they say what they say, and you can judge, right? But being an arbiter of somebody's honesty in the absence of other evidence or exhibits is hard. And that's exactly what I was asked to do in that moment. And so I was asked on all those news shows the next morning, and we stayed up. I didn't go to bed that night, no big deal, but that was the job, right? Late night interview, stayed up all night writing pieces for .com, doing GMA, doing our early Sports Center, all that. Manti Te'o was the victim in that situation, and people treated him as if he was a villain. And if you go back and you look at everything he said, he was telling us the truth. I think about the stuff that he lied about out of a sense of shame, embarrassment, which is natural when you've been catfished as he was. But to be in that moment with him, asking those questions and seeing his reactions, that was very memorable one as well. I remember the interview very well with Plaxico Burress, the first interview he did after he shot himself in the nightclub. I think it was the Latin Quarter nightclub on the east side of Manhattan. And right before he went to prison, that was, because it was almost, I think, it was about 10 months after the incident, 9 months after the incident. I remember it was my 40th birthday when I went down to do the interview. And it had happened at Thanksgiving the year before, and he hadn't done anything. And I'd been trying to get that interview for months and months and months. And that was made, to talk to somebody who, in that situation where they'd done something reckless and dangerous, but ended up costing them so much, their freedom, their career, their fortune, their reputation. And he was going off to jail, but that one I won't forget. And the other one that was really interesting, it was different. I said how rare those kind of live interviews are. When Darryl Strawberry was diagnosed with cancer, I did the first interview with him after that. And, it's kind of, it's 26 years later, 27 years later, how big Darryl was. What a big deal Darryl Strawberry was. And to hear Darryl Strawberry has cancer, this, guy we'd known since he was an 18-year-old, first overall pick, coming out of Crenshaw, all that, the legend that he was, and now confronting his own mortality. And I did that interview live with him and his wife from his home in, I think it was Fort Lee, New Jersey. And that was aired on ESPN1, ESPN2, and ESPN News live simultaneously. Excuse me. With no clock on it. And so that was a big moment for me as, again, a 28-year-old kid doing that with millions of people watching, including, my bosses in Bristol. And that was another one of those things where, it was all over the news, it was all over the back pages, it was all that. And those are the moments early in your career where you don't get mulligans, right?
Yeah.
And not only in terms of the interview itself, like I'm not gonna be able to interview him again, but in terms of like the question in the moment live, or if you don't do this one well, you're never interviewing Bob Knight 2 years from now when he gets fired, right? And so those are some of the big ones.
Jeremy, you were great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, that is Jeremy Schaap. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.